Okay. So, thank you for having me back. It's always very flattering when a club invites me to come back for a repeat performance. And this is a very different topic than I talked about last time. I need to tell you right up front that I'm not an expert on Flash, whatever that is. Until a few years ago, I was too intimidated to try it. I just figured the learning curve was going to be too high and I'd just stick with natural light. But now I'm really enjoying Flash and I try to use it to simulate window light and for more specialized kinds of effects. And the more I use it, the more I like it. So I'm somebody who understands the basics of Flash and I'm pretty good at explaining things. So tonight, my goal is to demystify Flash and prepare and encourage you to add it to your toolkit. We're going to be sticking to the basics, but for those of you who are a little more advanced on the path, I'll also suggest some resources where you can learn some more. There'll be a few slides where you might want to take a screenshot of some of the text points and things, and feel free to do that. And as Carmina mentioned, I'll stop periodically and invite questions because I don't want to get you too confused as we go along. So here is an outline of what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to talk about why you might want to use Flash. And keep an open mind with that. Even outdoors, Flash can be useful. And I don't have a lot of emphasis on that in my presentation, but we can entertain questions on that to some extent too. I'm going to talk about some key concepts and principles that you need to understand so that you understand how Flash works and how the light from a Flash works. Then we'll go into some of the practical stuff about how to use a Flash. And again, we're going to stick to basics. Don't want to overwhelm you with too much. And we'll talk about starter gear, both flashes and modifiers of various kinds. And then, as I mentioned, some resources for further learning. So why would you even bother learning about Flash? Well, I think there are a bunch of advantages. Number one, it's a really powerful way to add light. And anytime we're shooting in a low light situation, we are facing trade-offs as photographers. If we change our aperture, that changes our depth of field, and that may not be something we want to do. We need to keep our shutter speed in a range that it will help to compensate for camera movement and subject movement and so forth. So there's trade-offs there. And of course, if we raise our ISO, that can increase the noise. So there's always trade-offs. And sometimes the most logical thing to do is just add some more light. You can do that with continuous lights like LED panels, and maybe some of you have played with that, and I have those too. I rarely use them though, because Flash gives me much more power. A flash gun will put out more output of light than an LED panel. So there's nothing wrong with using an LED panel, but I do get more power out of my Flash, and it's more versatile. Flash will freeze motion, and that can sometimes be very helpful. It can help with camera shake and also subject movement, particularly if you're shooting pets and kids and things like that. It shouldn't be used for babies because the output from a Flash can be damaging for their eyes. And if you're a wildlife photographer, there's some debate about using Flash with wildlife, and I would suggest that you look into that because I don't do wildlife and really can't comment intelligently on that particular issue. Flash is small and lightweight and portable, which is a great advantage. I'm planning a trip to Hawaii this winter, and I plan to take a Flash with me because I've got some ideas about things I would like to shoot there where I can use Flash. It can be inexpensive if you buy an off-brand, and I suggest that you do, and we'll look at some of those options for you. I think that buying a Flash is one of the best value for money options in photography, and most of us like buying new gear and now and then, so you might want to think about some lighting gear. Flash is also color balanced, which is very helpful. I mean, you could use a desk lamp to light a subject, but the light would not be color balanced, and you could have some difficulties with white balance, which can largely be overcome if you're shooting raw, but Flash gives you that color balanced light to start with. It's also adjustable. Flashes tend to have a dial on them, and you turn it just like a radio dial. To turn the volume up on the radio, you turn the dial, and the same thing with a Flash. Most of them will go from full power right down to as little as 1/128th power. So I like that versatility. And it's really not so hard to learn. For years, I told myself, oh, the learning curve is just too impossible. I can't manage it. And really, when I got into it, there was a little bit of a learning curve, but it wasn't nearly as steep and difficult as I expected it to be. And I think you'll find the same thing. My favorite thing about Flash, though, is it's modifiable and it's very versatile. With Flash, I control the intensity, the softness, the direction, the color, and the shape of the light. And that just opens up tremendous opportunities for creativity. Instead of having to wait for the light I want, I can create the light I want. And I just love that freedom. Now, some people object to Flash. They say it's ugly light. And, you know, I got to agree with them that Flash can be ugly. This is my husband, who's always up for helping me out with practicing, and he's a good sport. Scott Kelby calls this revenge Flash. You use this kind of Flash when you really don't like somebody and you're doing their portrait. But Flash doesn't have to be ugly like this. This was shot with a pop-up flash on a camera, and it's pretty terrible. But we're going to talk about how you can produce really beautiful images with Flash. So on the left, you have a pop-up flash on camera, and on the right, you have two diffused studio strobes off camera. But, you know, you can spend tens of thousands of dollars on lighting gear, and you really don't need to. The secret to success with Flash is to get the flash off the camera. And we'll talk about how you can do that. So all except one of the images from here on in my presentation are all done with one flash. I like to keep it simple. When you get your flash off camera, then you start to get some really nice light. This was simply one flash modified with an umbrella on the left and a reflector on the right. That's it. It was that simple. This is the only image in my presentation that was shot with more than one flash. This one was done with two, simply because the group was so large. I had two flashes with umbrellas to soften the light. I had one on each side of my camera up high. It took me about 2 test shots to get the exposure right. I had my camera on a tripod only because I wanted to use a remote shutter release so that I could engage more with the group. I think the flash is the easy part of a shoot like this. That the hard part is getting all the faces visible, all the eyes open, and everybody looking in the right place. The fee that they paid me for this shoot covered the cost of 2 flashes and a transmitter. So my gear paid for itself in one shoot. But I don't really photograph people that much. It's my fine artwork where I mostly use Flash. So I use it for still life and flower work, as well as the few people images I do. One of my projects has been shooting elders' hands, and I've used Flash for that. Here I wanted a nice soft light rather than harsh shadows. And so I used a diffuse flash off camera, close in on the left, and a reflector on the camera right. And again, a very simple setup. I didn't have a lot of space because it was a potter's studio. It was cluttered, but it worked very well. You can also create harder light instead of that nice soft light. And here I've used a hard light to highlight the curves. This was backlit with my flash behind the flower and off to the left. And I didn't have a modifier on it, just the bare flash. And using it that way reveals the contours of the flower. And then I had a reflector on the right-hand side just to put a little bit of light into the shadows. You can also create some drama with flash. Here I was using a diffused flash from below the cello. And this is sometimes referred to as horror lighting. You don't want to use light from below when you're lighting people most of the time, unless you're doing a movie poster for a horror film. Then that can work really well. And you can do some special effects with flash. They're kind of fun to play with. This is an image of, it's 2 images put together. It's an image of smoke that was taken with off-camera flash backlit, and then I overlaid it with the calla lily. And then and the sky's the limit with flash. You can do so many cool things that I haven't even played with yet, but I wanted to share an example of what's called stroboscopic flash. This was done with sorry, my phone's ringing and I'm hoping my husband will grab it in a minute. This was taken by a photographer in our club, Brad Powell. And the way this works, I mentioned to you that flash will freeze motion. So he had his camera on a long exposure, and then he had set the flash. When I say a long exposure, in this case, I'm talking about a couple of seconds. And then he set the flash to put out a number of quick flashes while he was using a shutter speed of about 2 seconds. So he had the flash went off 5 times in 2 seconds. And as this dancer moved across the stage, the flash flashed those 5 times and caught her in 5 positions. And I think this is really an exciting possibility. And it's one that I will like to try sometime when I have an appropriate model to work with. So these last few slides give you some idea about the versatility of flash. So let's turn now and look at some of the basic concepts that we need to understand to get started. This is the theory part of the presentation, and I'm going to try to keep it very simple. So I would suggest that you think about flash like being a bucket of light. So here's an analogy. I have a bucket of white paint, and there's a fence with a small hole in it about 6 feet away from me. And I ask you to go around and stand just on the other side of the fence by that hole. And I throw my bucket of paint at the fence. What happens? You're going to get some paint on you where it passes through that small hole. Now, let's say that I go over to the fence, kind of a mean person, and I make that hole bigger and I ask you to stand there again. And I go back to my position 6 feet away, I refill my bucket, and I throw another bucket full of paint from the same distance. What happens this time? Well, you're going to get more paint on you, right? Because the hole is bigger. So flash is like a bucket of light that you throw at your subject, and the hole in the fence is your aperture. The bigger the aperture, the more light gets onto your subject from your flash. That's the first key thing that you need to understand. Not that hard, right? So let's do this again. We've got 2 fences, or we do the same fence twice with the different sized holes. We move you out of the way, and I throw my bucket of paint. What happens to something 10 feet behind the fence? Well, it doesn't matter how big the hole is or how much paint is in the bucket. Nothing's going to happen to something 10 feet behind because the paint isn't going to reach that far, no matter how big the hole is, or even if we take that fence away entirely. And it's the same thing with light. Most of the light from the flash isn't going to reach that far, and aperture makes no difference to that. You've probably seen people at hockey games or concerts taking pictures with their little pop-up flash, and the stage is like 100 feet away from them. That light never reaches where they want it to go. So your flash and your camera don't know what is subject and what is background. If the background is close in, it's going to get a little light on it. But if the background is any distance away, the light isn't going to hit it. So I most often have my background some distance behind my subject so that the light doesn't reach to it. Now, flash intensity is determined by the power of the flash and the distance to the subject. So if I throw a bucket full of paint at you from 2 feet away, you're going to get much wetter than if I throw it from 6 feet away, right? And if I have a full bucket rather than just 1/8 of a bucket, you're going to get wetter with that full bucket too. So in the same way, getting a flash closer to a subject gets more light on it. It increases the intensity of the light on the subject. And turning up the power of the flash also puts more light on the subject. So those are 2 things that we can manipulate to get the lighting that we want. So 2 things influence flash exposure, which we think of as subject exposure: flash intensity, which is power and distance, and aperture. The flash duration, the time that flash is actually going off, is so brief that for the subject exposure using flash, it's only the size of the aperture that matters, not the shutter speed. Whether you shoot it at 200th of a second or 3 seconds, the light from the flash is done in as little as 1/20,000th of a second. It can be 1/8,000th, 1/10,000th of a second, but in any case, it's gone so quickly that it doesn't matter what shutter speed you're using when you think about the exposure of the flash on the subject. So let's look at that a little bit differently. just take a different model here. So you probably already know that each one of these f-stops is one stop of light. And as we move down the list, each aperture lets in half as much light as the one above it. Okay, we got the big aperture, f2.8. We got the small aperture, f32. Maybe your camera goes to f16. But the light is one stop difference between each of these. When you add flash into the equation, each of these power ratios on the right is also one stop of light. So instead of adjusting aperture and shutter speed like you do when you're not using flash, we use aperture and flash power to get our subject properly lit. So let's say that we set up our flash, we set up our subject, take some test shots, and we find that we get just exactly the right exposure on the subject by using f8 and 1/8 power of our flash. Lighting's perfect, we're good to go. Then we decide, maybe I want a little more depth of field. So we decide we're going to change to f16. If we do that, we have to compensate with the flash power. F16 lets in 2 stops less of light, so we need to increase the power by 2 stops so that we let in more light that way, and the two compensate for each other. Similarly, if we decide we want to go shallower depth of field, then we have to, if we go to f4, we have to reduce our flash power down to 1/32 power because f4 lets in so much more light. It's a bigger aperture. Now, you can also adjust ISO. I try to just keep it at my native ISO on my camera. If I have to, then I'll raise it a little bit and then redo the exposure to suit that. So before we go on from there and talk about shutter speed and background exposure and stuff like that, are those concepts clear, or are there any questions about that?
You can just unmute yourself if you wish to ask Judy a question.
And if not, you'll have another chance in a minute or two. Okay, let's go on then and talk about background exposure.
Oh, actually, there's a question from Mary in chat.
Okay.
She says, you just used the term native ISO. What does that mean?
Oh, good question, Mary. Thank you for stopping me on that. Every camera has a range of ISOs that you can use, but they also have one recommended ISO or native ISO that's the one that's recommended. So for example, on most cameras, DSLRs and things like that, it's ISO 100. I shoot on an Olympus system and my native ISO is 200. And strangely enough, if I actually go down to 100, my image quality decreases. Normally we think that the lower the ISO, the better and the less noise, but each camera has a native ISO that's the optimum, the best image quality happens at that ISO. So for most of you, you can probably safely assume it's 100, but if you're shooting Olympus or Panasonic, and maybe some other brands, you may want to check that. That's an excellent question, Mary. Thank you for stopping me on that. So keeping your background some distance away from your subject reduces the amount of light that from the flash that hits it. And usually we want that. And there's something called the inverse square law. And I don't even talk about that because my eyes glaze over when we mention inverse square law. And I'm sure that yours would too. For now, just remember to put some distance between your subject and your background. And with the flash not hitting the background, it's only the ambient light that lights the background. So if you leave your shutter open longer, that's going to let more ambient light in, but it doesn't make any difference to the amount of the light that hits the subject from the flash. And the ambient light coming through the longer shutter speed will affect the exposure of the background. So shutter speed influences the amount of ambient light that gets to the sensor, and it influences the exposure on the background. Flash exposure isn't significantly influenced by shutter speed. So you got to think subject exposure, aperture, background exposure, shutter speed. Cameras have a maximum flash sync speed. It's usually 1/200th or 1/250th of a second, and you can find that in your manual. There are exceptions. There's something called high-speed sync, but we're not going to get into that tonight. It's a little more complicated. But normally you can't use flash with a higher shutter speed, or you get a black bar across your photograph. So if you ever take a flash picture and you look at it, it's got a black bar, you know that your shutter speed was too fast. And as I said, there is high-speed sync, but we're not going to go there tonight. You can use a slower shutter speed than your maximum flash sync speed if you want more light in your background. So I shoot a lot of black backgrounds or dark backgrounds. And so I usually start with 1/250th of a second. And that makes sure that not too much ambient light lights up the background. Leaving the shutter open longer lets more light from the background reach the sensor. But the flash, which lights the subject, has such a short duration that the extra ambient light makes no significant difference to the exposure of the subject. So to summarize, for background exposure, adjust your shutter speed. This would be a good slide to take a picture of, or a screenshot of, I think. For subject exposure, adjust your aperture. And ISO, of course, affects both, but use your camera's native ISO when you can. So my process when I'm using flash is I set my ISO to native. I set my aperture depending on what depth of field I want. Then I adjust my shutter speed to get the background exposure right before I add the flash. And if I want a dark background, I'll use a fast shutter speed. If I want my background to show more, I'll use a slower shutter speed. Then I take maybe 1 or 2 test shots with my flash, adjusting the flash output and the distance to the subject, the distance between the flash and the subject, to get good flash exposure. And sometimes I need to adjust the ISO. So here's what that looks like. This is a very quick grab shot I did just for this talk. The teddy bear is about 6 feet from the background, and the background is just an oak cabinet with a chair in front of it. The flash is about 3 feet away from the bear, a little bit up and to the camera left, about 45 degrees to the bear. And the left is my test image with no flash. And I deliberately underexposed by using a short shutter speed because I wanted the background dark. And then I added the flash for the second picture and adjusted the flash power and aperture to get the light I wanted on the subject. Usually I stick to my guns on what I want for aperture because I like deep depth of field and I don't want to compromise that. So I'll adjust the power of the flash by turning the power dial, or I'll move it closer or further away. So this was shot with bare flash, no pun intended. And that just means there was no modifier on the flash, no diffuser. For softer light, we could add a modifier, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. And these are raw files with no post-processing, but I just wanted to show them to you so you get the idea of how to set up your exposure for the background and for the subject. So any questions at that point? Okay, we'll go on. I'll give you another chance before too long. So there's soft light and there's hard light, and you probably know this from your non-flash work. Light will look hard with hard edge shadows, or soft, meaning it just has soft edge shadows, gradual fall off from the shadow area to the lit area, depending on whether the light source is small compared to the subject or large compared to the subject. So a flash head's pretty small, right? Does that mean you're always restricted to hard light? Well, no, because we can add a diffuser to soften the light. We can use an umbrella or a softbox or other kinds of diffusers. And then instead of the flash head being the light source, then the diffuser becomes the light source. And that's much bigger. So if you add a 12-inch diffuser close in when you're shooting a flower, you can get very soft light because the 12-inch light source, the diffuser, is large in comparison to the flower. For a portrait, you'd need a larger diffuser, maybe something like 36 inches or larger, because the relative size of the light matters. And a person's head and shoulders is bigger than that 12 inches. When they shoot cars for ads and things like that, they shoot them with 30-foot diffusers because they want soft light falling on the shiny cars. And this is why a cloudy day is better for outdoor portraits than a sunny day, because although the sun is a big thing, we know that, it's pretty small in the sky. And compared to our subject, it makes a hard light. Whereas when you get a cloudy day or an overcast day, all that cloud acts like a giant diffuser, and it softens the light and gives you nice soft light for outdoors portraits. So the important thing is the bigger the light source relative to the subject, the softer the light. And so I think it was Frank was mentioning, not Frank, Fred, somebody was mentioning, Alan was mentioning that he shoots macro. And when you shoot macro, if you've got a little tiny subject like a ladybug or something, you don't need a big, powerful light, because even the flash head is so much bigger than the subject that if you get in nice and close, you're going to get soft light anyway. So if you're thinking about modifiers to buy for your flash gear, those are principles to keep in mind. Big light sources, soft light. Small light sources, hard light. Any questions about those concepts or anything so far? Then we're going to talk about how to use flash. Okay, I hope that's clear. Great. Okay, how to use flash. My first point I want to make is I do not use TTL flash, and I'll tell you why. TTL stands for through the lens, and it's sometimes called ETTL for electronic through the lens. And it's basically an automatic mode where the camera decides how much flash to use without any involvement from you. And you could use flash compensation to overrule it, but then you might as well use manual flash in the first place if you're going to do that. The reason I don't use TTL flash is it tends to be inconsistent and unreliable. Now, there are a few times when I do use it, but those are rare. Here's why I don't. With or without flash, your camera's light meter tries to make your frame average out to middle gray. And that's fine for average scenes. A lot of landscapes, that works very well. But any scene that has large areas of brightness or darkness is going to fool your light meter, and it's still going to try to make them middle gray. So if you have an average scene, then maybe it's going to come out great. But if you have, for example, a white cat on a field of snow, your camera is going to go, oh my gosh, there's way too much light. Need to tone it down, underexpose. And your cat on the snow will turn out basically gray. And if you put a black cat in a coal mine and you want to shoot that, again, your camera's light meter wants everything to be middle gray. So it goes, oh my God, it's really dark in here. I better up the light. I better let some more light in. And you'll end up with basically a gray frame. And that's not what you want. And whether you're shooting with flash or not, if your camera's on auto, it's going to do this. If your flash is on auto, it's going to do this. It's much easier to get your exposure right with manual flash. And then any subject you shoot with the flash at that power and that distance and the same aperture is going to be exposed correctly. Light subjects are going to look light, dark subjects are going to look dark. Whereas if you use TTL, your camera keeps messing with your settings and you don't get the right thing. So normally, when I'm shooting without flash, I normally shoot an aperture priority. For the kind of work that I do, that is often the logical choice. There are other times I'll shoot in shutter priority and other times I'll shoot on manual. But flash is one of the few times that I use manual on my camera every time. Now, here is an example of simple automatic TTL flash. This was shot outdoors with a normal exposure in open shade, and all I wanted was just a little kiss of bare on-camera flash to put a catch light in the eyes, because without a catch light, eyes can look a little dead. In this case, the TTL worked fine because it was a pretty average kind of scene, and I wasn't even lighting the subject with the flash. I just wanted a tiny, low-power flash to go off and create that catch light. So that's the one time that I would use TTL. And the other, although I might occasionally with events, but I actually even prefer to shoot manual flash for events, because I usually have a pretty good idea of how far I'm going to be away from my subject. And I just find, again, more consistent results if I use basic manual flash. So here's how you do basic manual flash. And this might be something you want to take a screenshot of too. I set my camera on manual mode. Then I set whatever ISO I want to use. Then I set the aperture I want to use. And my primary consideration in that is my depth of field. And then I set my shutter speed for the exposure on the background. If I want it dark, I'll make it faster shutter speed. If I want more light on the background, I'll make it slower. And then I add flash to taste, adjusting its intensity, both the power setting and the distance from the subject. Now, I mentioned that you want to get your camera, your flash off your camera, and we're going to look at the gear that you need to do that. The tricky part of flash is not this part. The tricky part is setting up the initial settings for channels and groups and so forth when you're using a remote flash trigger. And every trigger is depending on brand. Every brand is different. So what I do, and this is something you only do once, you do your initial setups, you get that set, and then you don't have to do that every time you pull your flash out. And frankly, I use YouTube for that. I buy a lot of my lighting gear from Strobe Pro in Calgary, and they have wonderful videos on YouTube on how to use every piece of equipment that they sell. And so if my granddaughter came over and played with my flash and messed up the settings, I'd just go right back to that Strobe Pro video, set up the communication between the trigger and the flash, and then as long as nobody messed with it again, I wouldn't have to do that again. And this will become clearer as you practice. Now, I will give you one tip. A lot of us are shooting mirrorless these days, and many mirrorless cameras won't work with flash if they're set on silent shutter. Some of them just won't, and some of them you have to go in and change the settings so they will. So I recently switched from an Olympus EM1 Mark II, which just plain wouldn't work with flash on silent shutter, to an OM1, which will work, but you have to override the default settings and tell it, yes, I want to use flash with silent shutter. So the next thing we're going to look at is setups, how you might arrange your lights. Or your light, because basically we're using one. Any questions before we go on to that? I must be doing a good job. Either that or you're all scared stiff still. Okay. So I mentioned before, the secret to flash is to get it off your camera. And if you can get it off your camera and create a big light source, it's going to create really nice, soft light. And if you're shooting older people or anybody with skin blemishes, you want to have a nice, soft, flat light that will flatter that. It gets rid of the shadows that bring out the texture in the skin, so the skin looks smoother. So soft light means it's diffused, and flat light means that you're shooting with your light coming pretty much from the front on to the subject. A lot of the time you don't do that, but if you're shooting with people who have wrinkles or skin blemishes, this works really well. So you can use a wall or a large reflector, and you flash your flash into that wall or big reflector. That makes the light source the wall or the reflector, which makes it big in relation to your subject, and that gets rid of the shadows and makes the skin looks great. So both of these women they're friends of mine. They're both in their 70s. And when I made these portraits, I bounced my flash off a white wall right behind me. And that made the whole wall the source of light. It bounced into their faces and made very soft, flattering light. You can do this even with your flash on the camera. You'd have to get out of the way of it, but you could have your camera on a tripod with the flash on, and then turn the flash around backwards so that it faces the flash head. Instead of facing the subject, it faces the wall behind you, as long as that wall's white. If it's a green wall, don't do it. You're going to have green people. The other thing you can do if you can't get your flash off your camera is you can get the light source off your camera by holding a reflector on one side of your subject and bouncing the flash into that reflector so that it bounces off the reflector. The reflector becomes the light source. It's nice and big. And then your subject gets lit. And then I most often have another reflector on the other side of my subject to fill in the shadows a little bit. Now, I don't know about you, but I spent some time in my university years in the pool hall. And one of the things you learn when you do that is how a billiard ball will behave when it strikes the side of the pool table. And light behaves in a very similar fashion. When it strikes a reflective surface, it bounces off at the same angle that it hit the surface. And you might remember this from your science days of angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. So if we have our flash set up and we aim it at the wall at that angle with the red line there, it's going to bounce off at the same angle. If we change the angle of the flash towards the wall or the reflector, it's going to bounce off at that angle. And so the reason this is important to understand is if you've got a flash and a subject set up, you want your flash to hit the wall at the correct angle so it bounces and hits the subject. If you don't aim it right, you aim it at the wrong angle, then it misses the subject. So this isn't hard, but go out and play a little pool and you'll understand it very quickly. Now I'm going to show you something that I really wish somebody taught me 5-6 years ago when I was learning this stuff. Professional studio lights tend to have studio flashes or strobes have a modeling light in them, which is a constant light. You turn it on, you aim your studio strobe, and you can tell where the light is going to hit. Then when you go to take the picture, you turn the modeling light off and you take the picture with flash. Most flashes don't have a modeling light built in. There are some that do, but you can make your own modeling light. Just get a flashlight and a rubber band and put it on the top of your flash. And it's not going to be perfect in terms of showing you where the light will land, but it will give you a really good idea of where it's going to land. So you can turn your flashlight on, aim the light in the right place, turn the flashlight off, and take your picture with flash. That little stand that you see on the bottom of the flash, if you don't have a flash, you may not know that those come with the flash, and you can set it on the table. If you're doing macro work or flowers like I do, sometimes I just set it on the table in that little stand. Sometimes we get a little ugly behind the scenes, but I wanted to show you a typical setup for me. This was when I was learning about flash and I was trying to simulate window light. The window I had in this room was in a very shaded area and didn't get enough light for me to really light the subject well. I wanted soft diffuse light and a black background. So notice that there is a flash transmitter on the top of the camera, and that's there to communicate with the flash. It talks from the camera to the flash. And then the flash is aimed at a white blind that's closed to act as a reflector. And when I press the camera shutter, the transmitter sends a radio signal to the flash to tell it to flash at the power setting that I've set on the transmitter. Now, there are transmitters that don't let you adjust power from the transmitter. I'm trying to remember the name of those. It'll come to me in a minute. But I prefer the radio transmitter that lets you control the flash right from the transmitter and turn the power up or down from there, because sometimes my flash is up high on a light stand and I don't want to pull it all the way down, change the power, put it all the way back up again. I can do all that from the little transmitter, or sometimes called a controller. And you'll notice there's a piece of white foam core board sitting here in my little studio. And I didn't use it for the shot I'm going to show you. It could have been clamped in place to act as a reflector, but instead I knew I wanted black and white. I wasn't shooting for color, so I just left the overhead light on and shot that way. And this is the image that I ended up with from that. You'll notice, if I go back, you'll notice there's a black background here, and my black background is simply a trifold black foam core display like kids use for science fairs. And there's a piece of black velvet hanging on one corner. Sometimes I'll put that across the back of it too, because velvet really sucks up light. And if I want a black background, that can help. So another way to create nice soft light is to use an umbrella. And this is how I would set up if I was going to use an umbrella to shoot an arrangement of flowers. I would have the umbrella. Usually I like to light from the left. I think that's because we read from left to right, and when light falls from left to right, I follow the light into the picture. Maybe it's just me, but I prefer to light from the left. Then I have my reflector on the right. And having the umbrella and the reflector both be big and close in is going to make really soft light. And if it's too soft, I can move them farther away, or I can use smaller ones. Remember that you can adjust your shutter speed to adjust the background light, or if you wanted a brighter background, you could use a second light on the background. And I usually want none of my light to from the flash to hit the background, so I keep it further away. And I never have used another light on the background because it just doesn't suit my style. But one day I'll do that just to experiment. Again, it often doesn't look very tidy behind the scenes, but this setup resulted in some really beautiful images. So there's my umbrella. I've got the transmitter on top of the camera, the flash aimed at the umbrella so that the light passes through the umbrella and gets spread out by the umbrella to become a bigger light source. I keep the flash quite far back from the umbrella surface. That's, back on the stem of the umbrella. That maximizes the size of the light source, and that softens it more. And then keeping the umbrella really close to the flower also softens it more. And you can just keep moving things around to change the effect. I actually bought myself a little 9-inch softbox, which you'll see in one of the slides later on. And I used that for some flowers because I found the light was too soft from the umbrella. And I wanted something nice and portable that I could use quickly for my flower shots. So there's the image that resulted from that. That was flashed through the umbrella, no reflector, no overhead light. And you can see that the shadows are very, very soft. The light just kind of wraps around the subject because the light source is so much bigger than the subject, and it's diffused. If you were in on my minimalism talk, I think you've seen this slide before, but this is my typical setup for black backgrounds. In this particular case, I put my flash sort of side on to my subject rather than at a 45-degree angle because I wanted a little bit more drama. And there's a modifier on the flash that's called a rogue flash bender, and I'm going to show you that in more detail. There's my background at about 3 or 4 feet back from the subject, a reflector held on a light stand to the right, and this is what I was aiming for. I wanted this dramatic lighting of the curves of the tulip. I exposed to the right, which is sometimes called ETTR, which simply means that I set my exposure so that my histogram just kisses the right-hand edge, and that captures all the highlight detail. And then I can take the exposure down as I did here in post. I knew I wanted this to be low-key black and white, so I set up for that. We can do this with people. There's, most of the flash education online is to do with people. So I really wanted to make a point of showing you some stuff that wasn't people, because there's not a lot out there on that. I wish there was. A diffused flash is nice, especially for women, if you want a soft kind of look. So here you would set up your main light, which would be a flash with an umbrella. This is keeping it simple. There's lots of ways to do this, guys, but I'm trying to keep it simple for you. And then a fill light, which is just the reflector on the other side to fill in shadows. And the closer you get this two light sources to the subject, the softer the light, so you can move it back and forth, closer and farther away. And the larger the light sources, the softer. So here are a couple of shots. The first one was taken with one flash with an umbrella on the one side and a reflector on the other. And I don't know if you can see it on your screen. If you're watching this on a big screen, you might see that you can actually see the umbrella in her eyes. The catchlight is actually the umbrella. In the first shot, I was using a black seamless paper backdrop, some distance behind her, and my maximum flash sync speed, because I wanted that background black. I just thought she had such gorgeous hair, and I wanted it to stand out against that black. And then I thought I'd experiment a little bit. So for the second shot, I took away the black seamless paper and I had a light colored wall behind her. I made my shutter speed slower so that I would get ambient light on the background and it would appear light. But the aperture, the ISO, the flash power, and the flash to subject distance is exactly the same in both these shots. I could have added another flash as a hair light, which would be a lower power setting off at an angle behind the subject, just aimed at her hair. But I didn't do that here. And I have to admit, I've never done that. I like to keep things simple. Here's a similar shot with the reflector even closer in, filling in the shadows more. Again, this gal's in her 70s. And sometimes you don't want soft light. Sometimes you want harsh, dramatic light. And then you can shoot with a bare flash, which means you're not modifying it, you're not softening it, you're not diffusing it, and then move it a little farther away from your subject. And that makes the light harder. And that works with people. If you've got a craggy old man you want to light that way, it works with people, it works with other subjects. In this image, I was using a bare flash off to the left and behind my subject. And I had a reflector on the light on the right-hand side just to fill in the shadows a little bit. But I wanted to outline the contours of that calla lily as it laid on its side.
Judy, we have a number of questions coming in on the chat. Do you want to handle them now?
Let me address this slide and then we'll do that.
Okay.
Because it kind of follows on from the one before. So if you want the dark background, use your native flash shutter speed and keep the background far away. And if you want it lighter, slow the shutter speed down to allow more ambient light or light it separately. Okay, Brian, let's have those questions.
Okay, there's one from Joshua asking about do we need built-in flash and the disadvantage of using it? I believe that's
built-in flash. Is that what you said?
I believe that's where the flash is actually mounted on the camera as part of the prism.
Yeah. Most pro-level cameras don't even have a flash built in. And that's because if you really want to have nice flash, you want to get it off the camera. So my camera came with a little flash, which I've never used. And I only use a flash that's mounted off the camera. You could use it, but that's where that Scott Kelby Revenge flash comes in. It's straight on. It tends to be harsh. You can't as easily turn the power up and down, and you can't. It's much harder to put a modifier on it. So I urge you to invest in a relatively inexpensive flash that you can get off the camera. And we're going to talk about brands and show you some of those in a minute.
Okay. Penny asks if you can aim the flash into the umbrella rather than through the umbrella. When would you do that?
Yes, you can. What I've been showing you is called a shoot-through umbrella, and there's also a bounce umbrella. And actually, my shoot-through doubles as a bounce. It came with a black cover that I put on it. I have found that I don't use the bounce umbrella because the farther the light has to travel to get to the subject, the more power you have to use. And I don't see a discernible difference for me in the quality of the light from a bounce or a shoot-through. When I'm doing shoot-through, my light doesn't have to travel as far. And so I can use a lower power. And the advantage of using lower power is, your batteries last longer, but also your flash is ready to go again quicker. So you don't have to sit around waiting for the flash to charge up and be ready for the next shot. So I just use a shoot-through. It's cheaper to buy a shoot-through, and you get the advantage of more output.
There's a second question from Joshua. Would you recommend a Rogue Flash Bender softbox for ease of use, particularly when shooting outdoors?
Yeah, I like a Rogue Flash Bender. I was not the official wedding photographer, but I was a wedding photographer at my nephew's wedding. And I used the Rogue Flash Bender but I used it on my flash, which was on a flash bracket. And we'll get more into the gear in a few minutes. I'm gonna show you what these things look like and give you an idea of how you might use them.
There's a question from June about how do you hold up the reflector?
I have a clamp that fits on the top of my light stand, and it clamps to the reflector and holds it in place. And I'll show you that too.
Okay. And actually, I can answer this question for Angie. The presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to see the entire presentation when you watch the recording.
Yeah, but that will be on my YouTube channel, and it'll be up in a few days. So let's move on. Those were great questions, folks. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, you can get creative with flash. This was shot with bare off-camera flash. It's a slinky that I set on my dining room table. I like the patterns of it. You can add an acetate gel to the flash to get the color. And you can even just take the report covers that kids use in school. They come in different colors, red and orange and green. You could actually put a piece of that in front of your flash to make the light that color. In this case, I didn't use a gel. I actually did this in post by split toning. It's a black and white photograph that's got a purple split tone added into the highlights and the shadows. But the flash makes it easy to get that funky kind of lighting effect. And with two flashes, you could even use two different colored gels to get two different colors of light on your subject. And that could be interesting too. The sky's the limit, as I mentioned, and I'm trying to keep it basic, and I'm not an advanced flash user, but I just want to encourage you that it's pretty simple to get started, and it's a lot of fun. So let's talk about gear. Now you have some basic how-tos. I want to introduce some ideas about what you might want to get started with, because there's a whole world of lighting gear out there and techniques that I'm not going to get into tonight. I just want to get you started. So flash gear can be really expensive. And basically you need a flash, obviously, and you need some way for the camera and the flash to communicate. But there's no need to spend $600 or $800 on name brand flashes. Like this Olympus is an $800 flash almost, and the Canon is $500 on sale. There's no need to spend that kind of money. And if you're new to flash, you probably don't want to put that kind of money into gear because you don't know if you're going to stick with it. So I have an Olympus flash to go with my OM1 camera, and I never use it. I wish I'd never bought it. If any of you want to buy it, I'll sell it to you. What I use is a Godox flash. And these are very popular. They're quite well made, and I've had good luck with them. There are several different options. Godox is one brand that I can recommend. It also comes under the name Flashpoint if you shop at Adorama. Yongnuo is a decent brand. Nissan can make a good inexpensive flash. And when you go to buy your flash, you want to buy one that's for your camera brand. But it can be used with other brands. So I shoot Olympus. I can use a Nikon or a Canon compatible flash with my camera without TTL. And of course, I don't use TTL anyway, so that would be fine. Or what I ended up doing was I bought a Godox flash that is made for Olympus and will do TTL, even though don't expect it ever will. So when you look at the name of the flash here, this is a Godox, and you'll notice it's a TT6852C. That C just means it's made to be compatible with Canon. So if you're looking for a Nikon, you'd look for an N at the end. If you're looking for Fuji, you look for an F at the end. Olympus, you got an O at the end, that sort of thing. So right now, what I have for flash equipment is one Godox flash, one Olympus flash that was way too much money, and one Godox Studio strobe, and I'll show you that in a minute. Most often I use only one of the Godox units and a reflector, and usually that's a piece of foam core. We'll look at other reflectors too. One word of caution is if you have old flashes around from the film days, don't put them on your digital bodies, because they can really mess up the electronics on your expensive digital camera. You may be able to use them off camera, but don't put them on top of your camera. And then, as I mentioned, you need a way for your camera and your flash to communicate if you're going to have your flash off camera. So I recommend using a transmitter or controller that mounts on the camera hot shoe. And again, the initial setup for that can be a little tricky. And especially if you've got some poorly translated instructions. I used to drive myself a little crazy with the Yongnuo instructions, but YouTube is your friend. There are videos out there to tell you step by step how to match your camera and your flash controller, or your flash controller and your flash, sorry. I find Godok's a little bit easier than Yongnuo, and I'm not affiliated with any companies, but I found that I get good service at strobepro.com, and they have really good videos on how to set everything up. So I use this controller, a Godox X Pro 2, to trigger my flash and my studio strobe. I don't have to buy a separate controller for each one, because one controller can control a bunch of different flashes and strobes. And the flash and the controller together were just $282.90. You might remember that the Olympus flash I was looking at was like $700. I could add a second flash and still only have spent $442, which is well under the price of just one name brand flash with no controller. So this is why I really recommend that you look at other than the big brands. So here's what the back of the controller looks like. And when I showed this to a girlfriend, she said, "Oh my God, that's way too complicated. Too many numbers, I'm out of here." But don't let these things scare you. This area at the top, it says channel 10. That simply is something you set once when you teach your transmitter and your flash to talk to each other. And again, I use YouTube to know how to do that. And then the second bunch of figures here is letters from A to E on here. And those are just the names that the transmitter gives to different flashes. So I'm only using one flash, so I'd only have flash A. But actually, I have my studio strobe designated as A and my little flash designated as B. And then I just can control the power of each by just hitting the little button beside the letter and then moving that dial. The column here that I've outlined in green is the flash mode. And normally I just put that on M for manual. This one's set up for TTL, which I've told you I never use, but that's all that column means. So I just have M's all the way down my column. And then this area in pink or magenta that's set at 0.0, that's your flash power. And you just move this little dial, just like the button on a radio, an old-fashioned radio, to move the power up or down. Pocket Wizard is the name of the other controller, the one that doesn't let you control the output of the flash. They work, but you have to buy two of them, one to put on the camera and one to put on the flash. Whereas if you go this route, there is a receiver in the flash, and this is the transmitter, and you don't have to buy two transmitters. Then you need some batteries. And you really want high quality rechargeables for using with flash, because flash consumes a lot of power compared to other battery operated gadgets. One of the reasons that I bought a Godox Studio Light was to avoid the need for batteries. The strobe that I bought is plug-in only. A lot of them have a heavy battery, this big studio strobes, and too much for me to handle. So I just wanted one I could plug into the wall and not worry about batteries. But when I do use batteries, I tend to use the Eneloop Pro batteries, because they tend to hold a good amount of charge and hold it for a decent length of time. You could use, Energizer or any of the non-rechargeables, but I prefer the more environmentally friendly route, and these don't take all that long to charge up.
Judy, this is Carmina. We do have a break around 8. Would you like to have a break sometime, or you choose your break time? If it's about 10 minutes.
Okay. Let's finish this section,
okay,
and then have a break. The gear section.
Okay.
For shooting events, I use a flash bracket, and this is a picture of a flash bracket. That arm can hold the flash above the camera, or you can swing it over to one side, and that will help you avoid getting red eye. And then I also can use a modifier on the flash to soften the light, and I would still use a transmitter. And then for indoor work with subjects that don't move around, I use these inexpensive light stands from Amazon Basics. Was, what is it here, $36.30 for two of them. They're lightweight, they're inexpensive. These ones don't come with an umbrella mount, and if you want to use an umbrella, you do need that, so you'd order that separately. I like the 2-pack because I can use one as a spare, or I can use it to hold the reflector. And this is what the umbrella mount looks like. Again, inexpensive, $21 for two of them. These are newer brands from Amazon. And that's what holds your umbrella. And then you want a cheap shoot-through umbrella, $10 gets you one. And that's where I would start. A light stand, an umbrella bracket. This is not really practical outdoors unless you want to play Mary Poppins and let the wind take you away. But it's something to be aware of. And remember, the bigger the umbrella, the softer the light. So if you are going to be doing portraits of people, particularly couples or groups, you want to get a bigger umbrella than 33 inches probably. But I think I have two of them. One is 36 inches and the other one's about 42 inches. And I can do couples. If I use both umbrellas, I can, with two flashes, I can do groups like you saw in that group shot. And then these light stands are a little bit tippy. There are bigger industrial strength light stands that are way more expensive and I don't have space for. So I just have a 10-pound hand weight that I stole from my husband, and I set that on the base of the stand, and that keeps it from toppling over. You can also buy specialized sandbags to put on these, but of course that costs you a lot more. And then you'll want a reflector of some kind. You can use foam core, and I often do. But these 5-in-1 reflectors are a good deal. $15 gets you 5 different pieces there. And the advantage of this is one of them is a diffuser, so you can use it between the flash and the subject to soften the light. And here is what that clamp looks like that goes on top of the light stand to hold the reflector. Can hold it at various angles. And I find that very useful. I also, when I'm shooting small subjects like some flowers and insects and things, I find that the white styrofoam tray that you get under a roast of beef makes a wonderful reflector. It's curved, it's got sides to some extent, so it really makes a wonderful reflector. And you can also make yourself what's called a V-flat by taking 2 pieces of white foam core, putting them together, putting a strip of white duct tape down the edge so that it hinges it. And that V-flat will stand on a table or a floor. And you can make them small for macro. You can make them big for portraits. So for a starting kit, a flash with rechargeable batteries and charger, a radio transmitter, or you could use a cord, although that's a bit old school and it restricts how far you can get your flash away from the camera, an umbrella, a stand, and a reflector. And one more piece that I recommend is a gray card. You could use an old-fashioned flash meter to meter your exposure, and if you've got one, great, use it. They're great little gizmos, but they're expensive. And there's a much less expensive way to do it. What I like about a gray card is that you set up your lights, you put your gray card where your subject is going to be, you fill the frame with your gray card, and you take a shot with flash, and you adjust your flash until you get the exposure right. When you shoot a gray card, your exposure, your histogram should show pretty much a perfect bell curve that's down at the edges and goes up in the middle. Then you've got your exposure nailed. But the other advantage of a gray card is it's also useful for setting white balance. So after I've got my exposure right, then I would have my model hold the card, or if I'm shooting a vase with flowers, I might lean the card against it. And I take another shot with the subject and the card in the frame. And then when I go to post, all I have to do is take the white balance dropper, click it on that gray card, and it will correct my white balance to be just right. So that works well. Next section is modifiers, and I think that's a good place for a break, Carmina.
Hello, everybody. We finished our break, and we're going to now continue Judy's presentation. so you can start sharing, Judy, again.
Thank you, Carmina. And before I dive back in here, I want to give you a shameless plug. I'm doing a presentation for CAPA on October 17th entitled Getting to Wow. So if you're interested in that, it's at 7 p.m. Pacific, which is probably 10 p.m. your time, I believe. It doesn't sound right. But if you look at the CAPA website, oh, sorry, not the 17th, the 18th at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. October 18th, Getting to Wow through CAPA.
Okay.
All right. Let's talk about flash modifiers. I know there's a lot in this presentation, folks, and you may need to see it a couple of times. Right now, there is an earlier version of this talk on my YouTube channel called Flash for the Scared Stiff. And when I put this one up, which has been reworked and done for you guys, I'll call it Flash for the Scared Stiff at Etobicoke Camera Club so that you can tell the difference. But either one will give you some review. I think I've made it better this time around. So modifiers are simply things that you add to your flash to make the light softer or harder, more direct or less direct. And you can get all kinds of interesting effects with this. So here is my dining room table with a bunch of modifiers on it. They don't have to be expensive. They can be, but they don't have to be. Number one here is my shoot through umbrella. And I really think that's the way to go until you get more experienced with flash. Somebody asked about a Rogue Flash Bender, and this is a Rogue Flash Bender extra large size. And you can get it in a kit, which has the bender, the diffusion cover, which you're seeing here with the number 2 on it, and a grid. And these Rogue Flash Benders, they bend. They've got some kind of metal or something in them that lets you bend them around, and you can even turn them into a tunnel. And I find them quite useful. I have different sizes. The extra large can be a bit unwieldy, but I have used it at a wedding to take photos. And the smaller ones are wonderful for macro. This third thing here is an octagonal mini softbox, and you just Velcro it onto your flash head or elastic it onto your flash head, and it softens the light a little bit. So if you're working with small subjects like macro or flowers, that can give you some quite nice light, but not too soft. The one laying on the table, I'm afraid you can't see terribly well, but it's a circular thing about 12 or 14 inches in diameter, and it's a disc diffuser, they call it. And it has a gray card on the other side and the diffusion panel on one side, and you stick your flash up into that. And when the flash goes off, then that whole round surface becomes your light source. Number 5 is a thing called a light scoop, which is actually a very effective little modifier. It was invented and made in Vancouver. And I've used it for events. It gives good results. But the disadvantage of this is that it's rigid. You can't just stick it in your camera bag. So I keep that one in a cardboard box. And frankly, I don't use it that much anymore because it's rigid and hard to transport. And then number 6 is a commercial version of what we call a bounce card. You just attach it to your flash head behind the flash. You got your flash pointing straight up and this behind it. And then just like the light scoop there, and it reflects light forward and gives you some diffusion. You can make your own out of a stiff piece of white card and just tape it to your flash. And number 7, I use a lot of white foam cord as reflectors. I can bounce light off it. I can use it as fill to fill in the shadows. Something to keep in mind is that all modifiers that you use with your flash will reduce the amount of flash that gets to your subject. So you need to take your test shots with the modifier on. So these 2 photographs were taken with the light scoop and a reflector. And it worked very well for what I was doing here. These 2 photographs have been exhibited as metal prints in Barcelona. And I was very pleased with the performance of the light scoop. I'm not ready to get rid of it because it does serve its purpose very well. These were shot without a tripod so that I could move around. And this is one of the beautiful things about off-camera flash. You set your flash up, you set your subject in place, And as long as the subject and the light don't move, then you as the photographer can move all over the place, anywhere you want. You can get closer in, farther away, off to one side. And as long as your subject and the light don't move, you're good. Here's another look at the flash bender and how it works. The first picture on the left is without a diffusion panel, and you can see the flash head there. The second one is with the diffusion panel, and it goes and sort of encloses the flash head. And then the third one is where it's bent into like a mini strip box, and there's a grid on it. And each one of these iterations gives you a little bit different quality of light. And I can use this on camera for run and gun, but I prefer to use it with the flash on the bracket to get the flash away from the lens. And you can move on to soft boxes and beauty dishes and ring lights and strip boxes and all kinds of gear, but they can be pricey and they take up space. And I live in a small townhome and I don't have much storage space, so I look for small and portable. Somebody offered me a free beauty dish the other day and I would have loved to take it, but I just had nowhere to put it. This is a gridded snoot with diffusion. And now a snoot is like a tube that you put onto your flash to direct the light in a beam. And you can make one from a cheap sheet of black, flexible black foam from Michael's, just wrapped around the flash head. And it makes that tunnel to direct the light. And then a grid is a honeycomb or egg carton type modifier that can be used with the snoot to direct the light even more precisely. And this snoot is made by Rogue, the people who make the flash bender. And it comes also with 3 gels that you can put over the flash head to change the color of the light. And this photograph of the saxophone was taken with the gridded snoot. And you can see that the light doesn't spread out. It's more concentrated. It comes in more of a beam. These 2 photographs were also taken with the gridded snoot with some diffusion. And once you get the basic understanding of flash, you can play and play and play with this stuff because there's so many different effects you can get. This is a Godox Studio strobe, and this is the device that I bought recently. You can see it's not that expensive, 180 bucks Canadian, with free shipping from Strobe Pro. And it gives out more light than my little flash. So I've got more power. And because I like deep depth of field and I like to shoot it, maybe sometimes f/16, I need more power. And this gives me that more power. And it also plugs into the wall, so I never have to worry about batteries. And I can use the same controller because it's Godox. I can use my Godox controller that I use with my flash. I can also use it with this, and I can use it with both at the same time if I want to, although I never have. And I can use umbrellas like I do with my speed light. And it was not an expensive piece of equipment in photographic terms. And then I recently treated myself to a strip box because I wanted to make some really, I really love the old masters paintings, and I have a friend who's an expert at light painting, and I wanted to achieve that kind of light, which you'll see in a minute. And this strip box helps me do that. So this strip box was $155. It's collapsible, which is great. It goes into a nice compact case for storage. And I use it mostly for flowers. And it's really nice for glass because it makes a soft rectangular highlight on the glass instead of the hard specular highlight that you would get with a bare flash. And you could use this for individual people. But if you were shooting couples or larger groups, you'd probably want a soft box or an Optibox, or just the umbrella that I use for most things. These were taken with that strip box with no grid on it. I'm going to show you the grid in a minute. And the light was aimed so that it would just skim across the front of the flowers rather than hitting them full on. I just wanted it to skim across the front of the flowers. So it's very soft directional light. And notice the reflection in the vase. It's just a lovely, soft reflection rather than a hard specular highlight that you would get with a bare flash. Here you can see that again. Glass is really quite difficult to light. It's tricky. And so here I used the strip box on the side, and I had the diffusion panel on it, but no grid. Whereas I would have got the ugly specular highlights without that. So here's what that strip box looked like if you put a grid on it. You add that in, and it keeps the light from spilling out the sides and top and bottom, and it makes the light very, very directional. There are other ways to do that. There's a thing called barn doors. I have a set, and I've never really been able to get them to do what I want, but I need to experiment more, and then I will. And a discussion of a wide range of modifiers is beyond the scope of this presentation. But here's an example of another shot taken with that strip box with a grid on it this time to keep the light even more directional. And it's shot from the side with the light feathered, so it just skims across part of the subject instead of hitting the whole subject. So again, very soft directional light. And I think that lighting part of a subject adds interest and mystery to your shot. And I like to experiment with different degrees of lighting a subject. This one was, again, the strip box with a grid from the left-hand side. It's less feathered, more direct at the flowers. And I had a reflector on the right for a touch of fill. I think it was the styrofoam meat tray. And then I knew I wanted to go, because black-eyed Susans always make me think of old-fashioned flowers in Granny's garden, that sort of thing. I wanted a monochrome, a sepia kind of look. And by removing the color, then I get more emphasis on the light and the shadow and the form and the texture. Another example, a low-key black-eyed Susan with the gridded strip box off to camera left, skimming across the flower. These were shot with diffused flash and reflector. It can be a nice setup for portraits. One of these, the one on the right, was shot with a Rogue flash bender with the diffusion panel in place, and the one on the left was shot with an umbrella. And in both cases, I had reflectors. Placement matters. I wanted softer light with the umbrella on the gal on the left. This is the kind of light I've been trying for years to achieve, and I was able to do it with the gridded strip box on my studio strobe. And I really wish somebody taught me this, but most lighting tutorials, as I mentioned, online are all about portraits. And I wanted this sort of old Dutch masters kind of look. And I figured out how to do that by placing the gridded strip box off on the left-hand side and skimming the light across the front of that red sunflower. I could light part of the image rather than the whole thing. And that's exactly what I wanted. So I'm getting re-excited about flash and all the different things you can do with it. And I expect to be learning about this for the rest of my life. And then I put a little bit of a paint effect on this particular image. You know, I try to get my composition and lighting as perfectly as possible in camera, and then I will use post to enhance it and refine it, just like Ansel Adams used to do in the darkroom. Be aware that if you use a grid and you're shooting glass, the grid can show up in the reflections. And I don't know if you can see that, but if you're on a big screen, you'll see that highlight actually has the crisscross of the black sections of the grid. And I was kind of embarrassed when I shot this for a client, and she left me this arrangement, so I reshot it without the grid. You do have to be aware that your reflector can show up, your light source can show up in reflections. Again, an example of lighting part of the subject. This is just a sliver of light. This could be coming through a door or an opening in curtains, or even cardboard with a slit cut in it, which is my next thing I'm going to play with, is just a big piece of cardboard with a narrow slit, and use my flash through that narrow opening. So, you know, I encourage you to experiment and play. I know I've given you a lot of information tonight, and I didn't learn this in one go, guys. You may have to watch this presentation a couple of times and go and look at some other presentations. Expect failure. It's going to happen, but I don't think there's such a thing as failure. I think it's just a stepping stone to success. So, you know, Edison said, experience is the best teacher. The reason why I get along with comparative ease now is because I know from experience the enormous number of things that won't work. And I think that's a good attitude to take into playing. If you want some more resources, strobist.com is a good source for learning. I haven't looked there recently, but they used to have some good information at different levels of learning. Strobepro.com in Calgary is fantastic for gear. And even if you don't buy their gear, go look at their videos because they really make the setting up of the gear really easy. And then I like Amazon Basics for light stands. And then I like to support my local camera store too, as much as I possibly can. I do a number of these presentations. You've seen a couple of them. And I hope that maybe you'll be impressed enough to bring me back for another one at some point. The ones that are in red on this slide are on my YouTube channel. So you can go and have a look at those if those are topics that are of interest to you. And I would invite you to have a look at my website. I've recently redone it and it has some new work on it, along with several different articles and links to my YouTube tutorials. So thank you for having me back again. I'm really pleased to be with you tonight. And if you want to refresh this information, my earlier version of this talk is already on my YouTube channel, and this version will be on in a few days. So if there are any questions, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I know there was one in the chat, personal chat.
Yes, there's two. June, June asked if you could go over the grab card use again.
It's a gray card. Gray like the color. And all you do is you take this device and you put it in the light that you can use it without flash too. Put it wherever your subject is going to be. And you fill your frame with that gray card and take a picture and then check your histogram. And your histogram should show a little on each end, but mostly in the middle. It's going to be like a normal bell curve. And so that's how you use it for exposure. And then once you've got your exposure right on the gray card, go ahead and shoot your subject in that same position and same light. And then the other way you use it is have your subject hold it. Like if I'm taking a portrait, I'll have my subject hold it in front of them right close to their body, and I'll take a photograph, and then I just set that aside and do the session. Then when I take the pictures into Lightroom or wherever to process them, I get the picture with the gray card in it. I click my white balance eyedropper on the gray card, and it magically makes the white balance perfect. Without the gray card, you have to kind of adjust and tweak and try to get it right. But with the gray card, it's designed to have perfect middle gray and have the white balance right for you. So even if you're not using flash, you're lighting in your living room with a lamp, it's a great device to get your white balance right. And I used to use auto white balance. I no longer do that. I just leave my white balance on cloudy all the time because I like a bit of warm light. But I found that I was getting inconsistent white balance between different pictures. And so I just shoot with the same white balance all the time, and it keeps it constant.
Thank you. And the second question from Doris, how do you feather the light?
That's a great question, Doris. And it took me a long time to figure that out because nobody explained it properly. What you do is, I'm going to take a water bottle here. I hope you can see this. Instead of aiming the light right at the water bottle, you aim the light kind of just to skim past it. And it might take a try or two to get the right angle, but instead of aiming it right at the subject, you just aim sort of at the edge of it. What's a good analogy? Well, if you're icing a cake and you've got your knife and you're icing the cake, I mean, you could take that knife and slice right into the cake, but what you want to do is you just want to feather across the icing just to get it just lightly skimmed. That's what you're doing with the light.
And then, of course, we have a lot of, great talk, excellent, that the club thinks that this is great. I wanted to ask
you one more question, Carmina, that came into me directly, and I won't name the person, but she said, I'm embarrassed to admit my lack of knowledge about flash. This makes my head spin. I don't do studio work or portraits. All I want to do is take better lit images in the rec room at my great grandkids' birthday parties or Christmas morning downstairs. Great question. If that's all you want, you could try TTL, but practice in advance. Don't wait till Christmas morning to do it. Set up a teddy bear and take some shots at that distance. TTL might work okay in those situations, or know how far away you're going to be. You know which chair you're going to sit in and where the Christmas tree is, so you know your distance. Get your exposure right for that, and just use basic flash and try to get it either off camera or get a flash bracket and a diffuser so it's up a bit. You can do it. It's not that difficult. And I realize I do a lot of studio photography, but not everybody does. And for your purposes, TTL might work okay, but try it out before Christmas morning because you don't want to be disappointed.
And then we have Doris thanks you and says, great explanation. Thank you. And Sam enjoyed this a lot. I just wanted to ask you one question. I had a big failure with trying rim lighting. Have you ever tried rim lighting, to get, like you have a glass bottle and you just show the rim?
Yes. And if you remember the picture of the calla lily lying down,
yes,
that was rim lighting.
Okay.
I had my flash behind the calla and off to one side. So I used to think rim lighting, your flash had to be right behind your subject. That's not correct. It needs to be like off to one side and behind. So it's coming in at an angle towards the camera instead of straight at the camera. It's coming in from behind the subject and across. And that will give you the rim lighting. And then I used a reflector to bounce a little bit in to get the
okay, I get it. I get it now. Yes, that was a failure for me. So
well, I think that's the failure of how people teach, because people say, oh, use backlighting, but they don't tell you that backlighting doesn't mean that the light is right behind. And that's when it made sense to me, is when I put it behind but off to the side. That works.
So another question from June, how much space do you need in a studio room to shoot one person?
Well, I do mostly head and shoulders kinds of shots. And I like to have at least 4 and preferably 6 feet between my subject and my background. And then I like to use for portraits a 90mm lens. So I have done the portraits you saw of the ladies that I told you were in their 70s. Those were taken in a medium-sized bedroom, not a really tiny bedroom, but not a very big one either. So I don't know what that would be, 10 by 12 or something. I don't have a big place to work in, so I don't have a lot of space. I've also done portraits in my garage that way.
Okay, thank you. And then Sam asks, is your rim lighting a bare flash?
Yes.
Okay, that's the one where you don't diffuse at all. You just
right. And that may not be the only way to do it. Maybe next week I'll discover it works fine with a modifier too. But for now, I use a bare flash.